Born between AD 329 and 330, three men known as the Cappadocian Fathers would come to dominate the theology of the Trinity and leave a lasting impact on the church. Cappadocia is now central and northeastern Turkey. Today we're going to give an overview of these three men and also consider a heresy known as Apollinarianism. Now, all three of the Cappadocian Fathers were known for their strong support for the Nicene Creed and the homoousion position against the Arians and semi-Arians. And the three Cappadocian Fathers are Basil the Great, also known as Basil of Caesarea, his younger brother Gregory of Nissa, and his friend Gregory of Nazianzus. Together, these three Cappadocian Fathers would make the standard Orthodox definition of the Trinity universal. And that definition was that the Trinity is one essence in three persons, or one ousia in three hypostases: the hypostasis of the Father, the hypostasis of the Son, and the hypostasis of the Holy Spirit. From now on, that would be the standard Orthodox definition of the Trinity. Because you see, before their writings and before their ministry, those two terms, ousia and hypostasis, essence and person, they were often confused in pagan philosophy and even in Christian writings. Even at the Council of Nicaea, they were fairly interchangeable, but no more. The first Cappadocian Father that we're going to really consider is Basil of Caesarea, also known as Saint Basil the Great. He was born in Caesarea around AD 330 and he died in 379. During his secular formal education in Caesarea, he would form a long-lasting friendship with Gregory of Nazianzus. They would then depart ways, heading to learn from different schools around the Mediterranean, only to meet up again at school in Athens before again separating, only to be united again, this time in Christian ministry. You see, Basil dedicated the start of his life, his early life, to the study of the law and the teaching of rhetoric, or public speaking and debate and use of language. But this would change after meeting a powerful and compelling bishop who was a monastic, who lived a simple, ascetic lifestyle. Following his conversion, Basil would say, "I beheld the wonderful light of the gospel truth, and I recognized the nothingness of the wisdom of the princes of the world." Recognizing the nothingness of the wisdom of the princes of the world, he would follow the lifestyle of the bishop who led to his conversion. He travelled to the Middle East to study monasticism and the ascetic lifestyle. He gave his inheritance and wealth to the poor, and he spent time in solitude in the desert. But during that time in solitude, he came to believe that actually the way forward was a life of prayer in community. That was what was vital. And so he would seek to gather around himself like-minded people to live a religious monastic life together. And Basil's writings on the monastic life would form the bedrock of all future monasticism in Eastern Orthodoxy right through to this day. In 358, he invited his friend Gregory of Nazianzus to join him in this new monastic community, which he did for a time before returning to his home. In 362, Basil was ordained deacon, and then he was ordained presbyter in Caesarea in 365. These were not ordinations he sought out. He'd rather be left alone in his monastic community to pray and contemplate the divine. But they were personal requests from the bishops who admired him for the life he was leading. Over a series of years following this, Basil and Gregory Nazianzus would hold a series of public debates with prominent Arian theologians, debates which were overseen by people sent by the Arian emperor Valens. But during these debates, despite the prejudice and the seemingly stacked outcome due to the emperor, it was clear that Basil and Gregory Nazianzus were victorious. They were right, and many people were persuaded to embrace Nicene Orthodox faith, despite the influence of Emperor Valens. In 370, Basil was appointed Bishop of Caesarea, and he set about making ministry to the poor and the outcast his highest priority. He ministered personally to the poor through soup kitchens. He pastored prostitutes and sought to reform the lives of thieves. He encouraged the wealthy to give generously, and he criticised a corrupt justice system. Just outside the city, he built an immense complex of a poorhouse, a hospice, and a hospital to care for the poor and needy of the city, an estate known as the Basiliad. The final main thing to know about Basil is that he was a big fan of liturgy. Now, all of church was liturgical at this point. Indeed, it seems likely that the church was always liturgical to some degree, even in New Testament times. But Basil compiled many liturgical prayers, and his service of Holy Communion, known as Divine Liturgy, as it's still known in the Eastern churches, still forms the basis of one of the two main communion services in the Eastern Orthodox churches today, the Divine Liturgy of St. Basil the Great. The other main liturgy they use is slightly shorter, and it's known as the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, but it's very similar to Basil's, except for one hymn and also what is said in some of the silent prayers that the congregation don't hear. It's unlikely that Basil was much of an innovator in liturgy. Innovation was not really the way of the church, but his role in standardising liturgy, which would continue to be used even 1,700 years later, is worthy of note. So that is Basil the Great. His key contributions were around communal monasticism, the liturgy, the care for the poor, and the public debates he held against the Arians. Gregory of Nissa was the younger brother of Basil the Great, and I always feel sorry for him, because I know how much I would hate it if my brother James was called James the Great, and I was simply known as something like Adam of Yorkshire. Gregory of Nissa is the most controversial of the Cappadocian Fathers, but also the least studied. He was born in AD 335 and he died in 395. And he doesn't seem to have had the secular education that his brother did. He seems to have largely been homeschooled by his mother, been taught things by his older brother. But that didn't bother him in the slightest, because as far as he was concerned, his tutors, and the best tutors in the world, were Paul, John, and the rest of the apostles and the prophets. Unlike his brother, Gregory of Nazianzus, unlike his brother Basil and also Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nissa did not pursue a monastic life and even got married. Due to how the province of Cappadocia was divided up, though, under Emperor Valens, a bishop was needed for the newly created diocese of Nissa. And given that his brother Basil was the bishop of Caesarea and thus the top dog in the church in that area, it's not surprising that Gregory of Nissa was appointed bishop of Nissa in 372. Gregory of Nissa was less conflict-driven, less strong-headed and argumentative than Basil, and he tried where possible to reconcile with false believers and bring them back into the church, to change their ways through gentle persuasion rather than condemning them in grandstanding public debates. In 380, Gregory went to the Roman province of Armenia Prima to support the pro-Nicene Creed candidate there. But to his surprise, he ended up being appointed as the bishop in Armenia. But that didn't go well. Armenia was not Hellenized, it wasn't a Greek area, and he saw it as uncivilized, and so he left as soon as he could after appointing a different successor. In the last few years of his life, he would take part in the First Council of Constantinople and then be sent to Arabia and Jerusalem and other places to try and resolve conflicts in the church, largely unsuccessfully. Understanding Gregory's thinking and beliefs is difficult, as he never systematized his thinking. He never structured his works or his thoughts, and his highly philosophical way of thinking makes for dense writing where it's not always clear if what he's saying is actually his own thinking and beliefs or just thinking about possible answers to these things. You might remember those as the same kind of problems that plagued Origen. He's best known, though, as the one who said that the persons of the Trinity are distinguished most of all through their origin. The Father is unbegotten, the Son is begotten of the Father, the Spirit proceeds from the Father. Because in all things the Trinity acts together and there's only one God, it's through their origin and relationship with each other that they can be distinguished. A second strand of his thinking which is significant is that he emphasised the utter unknown character of the nature of God. Because God is infinite and we are limited, we can never truly grasp who God is, what God is, and how God is. Though we can try and grasp at easily understood images and similes, these are ultimately mistaken idols. Because God is infinite, we can also never cease to learn more about him and to be more like him in our spiritual journey, even though we never will be actually like him. Together, this thinking, though none of it really original to Gregory of Nyssa, would have a remarkable impact on the theology and mystic life of the Eastern Orthodox churches. Eastern Orthodox theology is very what is called apophatic, meaning to deny. Eastern theology rarely starts with statements of what we do know about God, but rather says what we can deny and leaves what is left over as the unknowable truth. This idea that we can grow ever closer to an infinite God in knowledge and likeness because he's infinite and we're limited would play into the Eastern understanding of salvation as what is called theosis, an eternal journey of getting closer and closer and more like God, being ever more enveloped and changed by the divine light, but never being truly like him because he is uncreated and we are created. He is limitless and we are limited. We'll consider both of those ideas, apophatic theology and theosis, more when we look at someone called Maximus the Confessor. Whilst his brother Basil focused on the poor and the outcast, Gregory had a very special heart for slaves. He was one of the first to say that the very institution of slavery, wherever it is found, however it is found, is inherently sinful. He was the first and the only writer in the ancient world to write a comprehensive and dedicated critique of slavery. For Gregory, it was part of how God made humans to be free, that we are to rule over the animals but not each other, that we have an inherent intrinsic worth being made in the image and likeness of God. In this sense, he foreshadowed many of the later developments in the Western world with ideas of inalienable human rights. If God is so gracious to buy us our freedom from sin and slavery to sin, how dare we even begin to think of trying to enslave people again to something else? Finally, and most controversially, Gregory of Nyssa, like Origen before him, appears to have been a universalist, someone who believes that ultimately everyone in the fullness of time, everyone and everything will be saved, will come around to worshipping God. But it's not actually clear that he really did believe this. He seems to think that the purification by fire in hell is to turn people to God, and he says that in various places. And at other times he seems to say that this is actually an eternal and unending fire, at least for some people, so they won't turn back to God. He certainly seems to believe that God intends to save all humanity through some kind of post-death purification. But whether this actually happens is another matter entirely. So that is Gregory of Nissa. Gregory of Nissa. He's important because he is the person who says that the persons of the Trinity are distinguishable through their relationships. He advocated for theosis and also an apophatic theology, and he opposed slavery wherever it might be found, and he was a possible universalist. The final Cappadocian Father is Gregory of Nazianzus, and I wish there weren't two Gregories of N in this lecture, but Gregory of Nazianzus was a close friend of Basil the Great and lived, like him, a monastic life. He was born in AD 329 and he died in AD 390. He's also known as Gregory the Theologian, and he was ordained presbyter in Nazianzus in 361. And whilst he was a presbyter, Julian the Apostate came to power, the last pagan emperor of the Roman Empire. Interestingly, as a side note, both Gregory of Nazianzus and Basil the Great had actually known Julian the Apostate when they were in Athens. They were all going to the same school in Athens. Despite this, despite knowing Julian personally, Gregory was vocal in his opposition to this pagan emperor, and he declared that Christianity would overcome pagan and evil rulers through prayer, through love, and through patient endurance. Julian decided that he was going to crush the likes of Gregory, but he died shortly afterwards before he could actually carry this out. In 372, Gregory of Nazianzus was appointed Bishop of Sasima. There's a tongue twister for you, Sasima. By now, he was well known for his public stance against Emperor Julian the Apostate and for his public debates against Arians that we mentioned before with his friend Basil. Gregory, though, he didn't want to be bishop. He wanted to dedicate himself to a life of prayer, a life of a monk seeking after God, and Gregory would actually resent being a bishop later in life. He felt that he was forced into being a bishop by his overbearing father on the one hand, who was the Bishop of Nazianzus, and his strong-willed friend Basil on the other, who also wanted him a bishop in his area. After his father died, it was expected that Gregory of Nazianzus would take over for his father as bishop in Nazianzus. He'd been running this diocese for a number of years as his father was too ill to do so. But instead, he went into monastic isolation. Emperor Theodosius, who held the First Council of Constantinople and declared Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, he had Gregory installed as the Bishop of Constantinople to oversee the First Ecumenical Council of Constantinople. But Gregory resigned as that because when it came to that first council, there were some who felt this was illegitimate because he was already Bishop of Sasima and Nazianzus. So he stepped aside in order to keep the unity of the council and the church. After the council, he returned to Nazianzus, and there he would continue his fight against the Apollinarian heretics. Gregory's life was dominated by submitting to the will of others rather than doing what he personally wanted, which was to live a simple monastic life of contemplation. Pushed on by his father and his friend and even the emperor himself, he was thrust into power and authority on the public stage. Of all the Cappadocians' writings on the Trinity and the incarnation of Christ, his would have the greatest impact. And it is to the latter of those, how Jesus Christ was fully God and fully man, that we shall now turn. Let's introduce our final character for today, Apollinarius of Laodicea. Apollinarius was one of the most recognised theologians of the Nicene faith, along with the likes of Athanasius and the Cappadocian Fathers. He was hugely respected. However, later in life, his rejection of Arianism went too far. He was so concentrated on the fact that if Jesus were a mere creation, a mere man, we could not be saved, that he went too far in the other direction. He wanted to emphasize the deity of Jesus. And so Apollinarius claimed that Jesus did not have a rational human mind, which was in his mind surely something that was corrupt and sinful. Instead, Apollinarius said Jesus had a divine mind. The Son of God took the place of the human mind. Behind this is the basic belief found in Greek philosophy, but also in the New Testament, that humanity is made up of three distinct parts: the mind, the body, and the soul. Or the body, the sensitive, emotional soul, and the rational spirit. The body, the soul, and the spirit. For Apollinarius, the Word of God, the second person of the Trinity, took the place of the rational spirit or mind, and he was the one who animated and gave life to the body and soul of the human Christ. The divine driver of the body and soul was the divine person of the Son. This was too much for Gregory of Nazianzus. It simply wouldn't do if the saviour of the world was only 2/3 human, like some kind of monstrous zombie piloted by a divine spark. As Gregory would say, only a Christ who had all the elements of human nature could redeem all of man. And if every phase of man's nature was not redeemed, redemption would not be a fact. Arius was wrong, because unless Jesus is fully God, he cannot bear the infinite penalty of sin on the cross and save us. But Apollinarius is wrong, because unless Jesus is fully human, not 2/3 human, then we cannot be saved, because we need for all of us, mind, body and soul, to be saved. As Gregory would summarise it, and as the Church has said ever since, what has not been assumed, that is, taken up, has not been healed. What has not been assumed has not been healed. Because all of Adam fell in the garden, so the second Adam, Jesus Christ, had to take up all of human nature and heal it. If you take away the human mind of Christ, then, so says Gregory, God could have become an incarnate bull or a goat or an ox. They have flesh, they have a sensitive soul. Why did he have to be human? Because he had to have a human rational mind, that thing which makes us different from the beasts of the field and the fish of the sea, being made in the image and likeness of God, to think. Like Arianism, which remains very prevalent in the church, especially in the evangelical church, so Apollinarianism remains tragically common today. Indeed, I suspect it is the default position of most people who sit in church pews Sunday by Sunday, but somehow in crude terms, Jesus is the human who is like a robot piloted by God. Jesus is a human robot piloted by God. In wanting to stress the deity of Christ against the liberal world around us who say he was just a mere man and a great teacher, we go too far and we leave people to fall into the trap of Apollinarianism. So, Gregory of Nazianzus was a great theologian who combated various heresies. He combated Apollinarianism. That's the important one. He taught that Jesus must have a human mind, a human body, and a human soul, saying that whatever has not been assumed by Christ has not been healed. Which leaves us with a few questions. Basil the Great cared for the poor, and Gregory of Nissa opposed slavery. What ought the church be doing today? Who are the most in need and vulnerable in our society? Gregory of Nazianzus and Basil the Great opposed Arianism in public debates. Gregory of Nissa was much quieter and more relational. How do you see these two approaches active today, and are they both necessary? Gregory of Nazianzus spoke about the victory of the church over evil rulers and governments through prayer and patient love. Where have we seen this in history, and what message should it give us today? Finally, how can the church protect against Apollinarianism today, and why does it have such a strong attraction?